Those guys are good. This is a hard act to follow, and I'll do my best here. So I work for the Nonprofit Housing Association. And really, we're the member association that supports the nonprofit sector, looking at research, advocacy, and supporting them with education. The team that I work on is focused on the building stock, really looking at how we can support members to manage their buildings and improve their buildings through time. So the sector's pretty big. And one of the things that we have done over the past 10 years is built a database of the nonprofit housing sector. So right now, the slide says 3,200 buildings. We've actually got 3,500 buildings. And the key thing we're doing right now is trying to connect those buildings to Energy Star Portfolio Manager and their utilities. So we've got about 700 buildings connected to ESPM, and I say connected. They're in ESPM, and we're working very hard to get them actually connected to Portfolio Manager and to the utilities and getting the data flowing properly. Building sector, total range of buildings, single-family homes to large care homes and everything in between. So it's interesting, and all sorts of operating agreements, so it's interesting to hear about. I love the CMHC comments this morning. I think it's so fabulous. It's like, yes. Because that's the kind of stuff that makes it hard to say the split incentive is the problem. Because then you've got groups like Vancouver Native. It's going to be hard to remember the new brand, but I'll get there. It takes time. But it's not always the case. So in many cases, the nonprofit's paying it. In some cases, the tenants are paying it. In some cases, BC Housing's paying it. So we can't, the hard part about all of this is broad brushstrokes don't really work. So we have to be pretty careful with how we apply the rules and regulation, and really the key for me is funding. I think the nonprofit housing sector, they're at the kind of core of the affordability crisis, but not just the affordability crisis. There's mental health in there, addictions, poverty, generational trauma. Like, you've got everything mixed in and chucked into a tenant population. And I think they're dealing with a lot in the built environment. And I missed it in the last slide. But based on the database that we have, we're dealing with about $1 billion in deferred maintenance right now. And over the next 10 years, that's going to increase by $5.6 billion. So that's just the nonprofit sector. Some of the buildings will be redeveloped and need to be. Hearing about the on reserve housing that was built in the 80s and early 90s, it's like, man, we built shit housing everywhere during that period, and it all needs to be torn down. But they're dealing with overheating, aging buildings, and in many cases, because of the energy issues, they're dealing with a lot of mold. And you're going to find that all across the board. So this isn't something that one organization can fix, I think, is the big thing. This is something where we need to break out the bits of funding and say, the grid impacts are this is what we need out of BC Hydro, carbon, risk, energy, incentives, insurance, everything's got to come together to make this work. But I love this that Vancouver put together. So it shows heat risk. And most of the red areas are where the nonprofits are. No, it's based on roads and tree cover. So all of the low-income areas have fewer trees and more roads, so they're hot. This is just highlighting, that inequity. And we don't usually look at just the energy piece of the costs. We look at the rent and utilities and look at people who are in core housing need. So in theory, you should be spending less than 30%. And I love how people go with 30% is what you should be spending. It's less than 30%. Not 30%, it's less than. So, but what we're looking at in the rental sector is across Canada, most renters are spending more than 42% on their housing and utilities. And then there's a significant portion, over 20, I think it's 21 there in BC, that are spending more than 50%. So we got a big problem. And it's going to take a lot to solve it. And so it's not just that, like the homeless count has only gone up and up and up. So yeah, I think it's a huge issue, and we need broad consensus in what we're doing to solve it. So, and I think the beauty of some of our work, in 2009, we did a sector-wide asset analysis survey, census, gathered a ton of utility data. The nonprofit housing sector consumes 60% more than the average market housing. And there's a slight anomaly around townhomes, don't know why. But there's a mix of issues that we need to look at to deal with that. So we can't say we need to look at the efficiency of this stock and base utility costs on that. Some of this is the buildings and building needs. Some of it's the tenant population. So if you have two like-for-like buildings, one's got seniors in it and one's got bachelor suites, and they're working, they're totally different energy use. Seniors are going to use way more. Also, there could be some knowledge around how they're using the buildings, so they tend to moderate the heat by opening the windows, not turning the heat down. So you've got all sorts of issues baked into this schematic, but 60% more than average. So this needs to be our target for what we fix. And I think one of the other pieces that we've seen through time, and I hate to, well, I don't hate it. CMH, we got CMHC earlier. There's a little bit of BC Hydro. This is BC Hydro's rebates that are flowing into the nonprofit sector through time. So over the past 10 years, the rebates that they've put into the sector have gone from mid-60s to 5. So I hate to say it, but they kind of come to the table. So it's a huge issue. But I think that all of these issues really, when you look at the housing stock, are a massive opportunity. So this shows our building portfolio by kind of 10 years built. A lot of single-family homes, a lot of apartment buildings, a lot of inefficient buildings. But the reality is they're all reaching their midlife crisis. With that said, many of the buildings in the 80s and 90s need to be torn down, but midlife crisis is when you've got the opportunity to do windows, envelope, roofs. Start looking at the big measures and hitting them. And I think we're partly doing that, but we need a lot more. So it's a huge opportunity.